The church doors slammed shut as whispers spread like wildfire. The bride stood frozen at the altar, her hands trembling inside white gloves already damp with sweat. Guests turned their heads, confused, impatient, then cruel. "Where is the groom?" someone murmured. Minutes passed. The man she married, the disabled man everyone mocked, was nowhere to be found. Her heart pounded as shame, fear, and doubt crashed together in her chest. She had chosen love over pride. But on her wedding day, love disappeared, leaving her alone in front of the world. And what awaited her next would change her life forever. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you believe powerful stories still matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Long before the wedding day that would shake the entire town, Mwikali had already learned what it meant to be looked down on. She learned it in the market, where dust clung to her sandals, and the smell of fabric dye never quite left her hands. She learned it in the way customers bargained harder with her than with others, assuming that because she was quiet she would accept anything. And she learned it in the whispers that followed her whenever she walked past groups of women who wore better shoes, smoother wigs, and louder confidence. Anne was 27, unmarried and poor. In this town, that alone was enough to earn her pity. But when the news spread that she was about to marry a disabled man, pity quickly turned into ridicule. It started as murmurs. "Did you hear? Mwikali is getting married. To who? To that man who walks with crutches." By the end of the week, everyone knew his name, Elijah Kwarteng, even though very few people had ever spoken to him. Anne noticed the change immediately. Women who used to greet her with polite smiles now stared openly. Some shook their heads. Others laughed when they thought she couldn't hear. One afternoon, as Anne arranged folded fabrics on her wooden table, a familiar voice cut through the noise of the market. "So it's true, Linda Owino," said, her tone sweet but sharp. "You're really marrying him." Anne didn't look up right away. She kept smoothing the fabric, aligning the edges carefully, as if precision could steady her heart. "Yes," she said calmly. "It's true." Linda let out a soft laugh, the kind meant to draw attention. A few women nearby leaned closer, pretending to examine vegetables while listening closely. "Anne, you're still young," Linda continued. "You're beautiful. Why would you throw your life away like that?" Anne finally raised her eyes. Linda stood there in a crisp dress, gold earrings catching the sunlight. Everything about her spoke of comfort and confidence. "I'm not throwing my life away," Anne replied. "I'm choosing it." Linda's smile stiffened. "Choosing suffering." A woman behind her added, "People say he can barely walk." Another voice chimed in. "Does he even work?" The questions came fast, careless, cruel. Anne felt her chest tighten, but she didn't step back. "He's kind," she said quietly. "That's enough for me." For a moment there was silence. Then laughter broke out, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. Anne turned back to her fabrics, signaling the conversation was over. But the damage lingered heavy and invisible. That evening she returned home to the small house she shared with her mother and younger brother. The walls were thin, the furniture old, but it was clean. Anne washed her hands at the basin when she heard her mother's voice. "They were talking about you again today," Mama Naliaka Mwikali said, standing by the doorway. Anne nodded. "I know." Her mother sighed deeply, rubbing her palms together. "My daughter. People can be cruel. I can handle them," Anne said, though her voice wavered slightly. Mama Naliaka looked at her with worried eyes. "I'm not afraid of people. I'm afraid for you. Life is already hard. Marriage makes it harder even with a strong man." Anne dried her hands slowly. "Elijah is strong," she said. "Just not in the way they expect." From the corner of the room, Brian Mwikali scoffed. "Strong how?" he asked. By limping, Anne turned to him sharply. "Brian, I'm just saying the truth." He continued, "What happens when you have children, when you get sick, When money runs out, Anne took a deep breath. She had asked herself those same questions late at night staring at the ceiling. But fear had never given her a better answer than love had. "I'd rather face a hard life with someone who respects me," she said, "than an easy life with someone who doesn't." Brian shook his head. "You're letting emotions blind you," maybe Anne replied softly. "Or maybe you're letting fear blind you." That night, Anne lay on her mat, unable to sleep. She thought of Elijah, of the way he listened more than he spoke, of the patience in his eyes, of how he never once looked at her with pity. They had met months ago when Anne was closing her stall. He had stood a few steps away, leaning on his crutches, waiting quietly, until she noticed him. "I don't have much money," he had said then, almost apologetically. "But I need fabric for a shirt." Anne remembered how embarrassed he looked, as if asking for help was a weakness. "You don't have to explain," she had told him. "Tell me what you like." That simple exchange had grown into conversations, then shared walks, slow ones, then trust. Elijah never complained about his condition. He never blamed the world. And that, more than anything, had drawn Anne to him. Days passed and the wedding date drew closer. The whispers grew louder. At the market, customers asked questions disguised as concern. "Are you sure about this marriage? You know people will laugh. You deserve better." Anne smiled through it all, though each comment left a small bruise inside her heart. One afternoon, as she packed up her stall, she saw Elijah standing at a distance. He watched the market quietly, as if observing something far beyond the noise. "They were talking again," Anne said when she reached him. Elijah nodded. "I know. I'm sorry," she added, surprising herself. "For what?" "For the way they treat you." "Because of me?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "Anne," he said gently, "they treated me that way long before you." She swallowed hard. "Does it ever bother you?" He looked away for a moment, then back at her. "It used to," he admitted. "Now I just listen." "To what?" "To who I am," he said, "not who they say I am." Anne felt something warm rise in her chest. In that moment, the noise of the world faded. There was only the two of them, standing imperfect but honest in the middle of judgment. As they parted ways, Anne didn't notice the woman watching from across the street. Well-dressed, still, her eyes fixed on Elijah with something that looked dangerously close to recognition. The woman said nothing. She simply turned and walked away. Anne, unaware, went home believing she understood the weight of her choice. She didn't know yet that her decision to marry a man everyone mocked had already stirred forces far bigger than gossip, and that love once chosen publicly would soon be tested publicly too. The first time Anne Mwikali truly noticed how different Elijah Kwarteng was from other men, it wasn't because of the way he walked. It was because of the way he waited. She had closed her stall late that evening, the sun already sinking low, staining the sky with orange and gray. Most men in the market moved loudly, announcing themselves, demanding attention. Elijah didn't. He stood several steps away, leaning lightly on his crutches, as if unsure whether he was allowed to take up space. "You can come closer," Anne had said, spotting him from the corner of her eye. "I didn't want to rush you," Elijah replied. That sentence stayed with her. Now, months later, as they walked slowly along the dusty road leading toward Anne's home, that same quiet patience surrounded him like a shield. They walked at his pace, not fast, not slow, just steady. Anne had learned to match her steps without thinking. At first she had worried he might feel embarrassed, but Elijah never rushed, never apologized for his body. He simply moved forward, one careful step at a time. "People stare a lot," Anne said suddenly, breaking the silence. Elijah smiled faintly. "Only when they think I don't notice." She glanced at him. "And do you always?" he said. "I just choose not to answer them." That answer unsettled her in a good way. Most men Anne had known were eager to explain themselves, to defend their worth. Elijah didn't. He carried his dignity quietly, like something too precious to waste on strangers. They stopped near a small roadside bench. Elijah sat carefully, placing his crutches beside him. "You don't have to walk me home every time," Anne said. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She sat beside him. The bench creaked under their combined weight. For a moment, neither spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Anne finally said. Elijah nodded. "Does it ever make you angry?" she asked. "The way people talk about you?" Elijah exhaled slowly. "It used to, when I was younger. And now I know anger won't make my legs stronger," he said gently. "But it can make my heart smaller." Anne looked down at her hands. No man had ever answered her like that. She hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. "What happened to you?" Elijah's jaw tightened just slightly. "An accident," he said. "What kind? The kind that changes everything." Anne waited. He didn't continue. She could have pressed. Many people would have. But something in his eyes asked for patience, not curiosity. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You don't need to be," Elijah replied. "It's my story to carry." As they resumed walking, Anne realized something important. Elijah never asked her for pity, never asked her to save him, never asked her to prove anything, and that more than strength or wealth made her feel safe. Days later, Anne invited Elijah to her home for the first time. Mama Naliaka watched from the doorway as Elijah entered, her expression cautious. Brian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "Good evening, ma'am," Elijah said politely, lowering his head slightly. Mama Naliaka nodded stiffly. "You're welcome." Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Brian broke the silence first, so he said, looking directly at Elijah, "How do you plan to take care of my sister?" Anne stiffened. "Brian, it's a fair question," Elijah said calmly. Brian raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Elijah placed his hands flat on the table. "I don't have much money," he said, "and I won't pretend I can do things I can't, but I will never disrespect Anne. I will never raise my voice at her, and I will never make her feel small." Brian scoffed. "That's not enough." Elijah met his gaze. "It's not everything, but it's my beginning." Mama Naliaka studied him closely. "And when life becomes difficult?" she asked. "When sickness comes, when hunger comes," Elijah didn't hesitate. "Then I will stay." That word hung in the air. Stay, not fight, not run, not promise miracles. Just stay. Anne felt tears sting her eyes. She had seen men disappear at the first sign of hardship. Elijah's promise, though simple, felt heavier than gold. After dinner, as Elijah prepared to leave, Mama Naliaka stopped him. "You walk with pain every day," she said. "Why invite more pain by marrying into poverty?" Elijah smiled softly. "Because love that grows in comfort often runs at the first storm. I want the kind that has already seen rain." Mama Naliaka didn't reply, but as she watched him leave, something in her gaze softened. Outside, Anne walked Elijah part of the way. "I'm sorry about Brian," she said. "He loves you," Elijah replied. "That's not something to apologize for." She hesitated. "He doesn't think I'm making the right choice." Elijah stopped walking. "Do you?" Anne met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded as if that settled everything. As the days passed, Anne noticed things she hadn't before. Elijah avoided certain streets. He never spoke about his childhood. And whenever his phone rang and he saw the name on the screen, his expression changed. Not fear, but restraint. Once she caught a glimpse of the name before. He turned the phone face down. "Yeah. Is everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said quickly. "Just old things." Anne didn't press, but the unease grew quietly inside her. One afternoon at the market, Anne saw the same well-dressed woman again, the one she hadn't noticed before. The woman stood near the entrance, watching Elijah from afar as he waited for Anne to finish with a customer. Their eyes met. The woman froze. Elijah looked away first. Anne felt a chill creep up her spine. "Do you know her?" Anne asked later. Elijah shook his head. No, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, Anne lay awake, staring into the darkness. She trusted Elijah. She believed in him. But trust, she was learning, did not mean knowing everything. As the wedding day drew closer, Anne sensed that Elijah carried a weight he had never named. A past, carefully folded and hidden like a letter, never meant to be read. And though she didn't yet understand it, Anne Mwikali was already walking toward a truth far larger than love alone. A truth that would soon step into the light on the very day she said "I do." Opposition did not arrive suddenly. It had always been there, quiet at first, like a distant drumbeat Anne Mwikali tried to ignore. But as the wedding drew closer, that rhythm grew louder, heavier, impossible to escape. It began inside her own home. Mama Naliaka Mwikali sat on the edge of Anne's bed one evening, folding and unfolding the same piece of cloth in her hands. The room was dim-lit only by a single bulb that flickered when the power wavered. "You know I raised you to be strong," her mother said slowly, "not reckless." Anne sat upright, her back against the wall. "Choosing Elijah isn't recklessness," Mama Naliaka sighed. "You speak like love feeds mouths." Anne swallowed. "It doesn't, but neither does fear." Her mother looked at her, then really looked at her. "You don't see what I see," she said. "I see a life of struggle. I see you carrying burdens alone." Anne's voice softened. "I've carried burdens alone before." Mama Naliaka's hands trembled. "Marriage is different. It ties your future to someone else's limitations." Anne leaned forward. "Or to their values." The older woman shook her head. "You think kindness will protect you from hunger." "No," Anne replied honestly. "But cruelty won't either." That conversation repeated itself in different forms over the following days. Each time the words grew sharper, the silences longer. Brian Mwikali, unlike their mother, did not soften his concerns. "You're being naive," he said one afternoon, pacing the small living room. "People will laugh at you forever." Anne stood her ground. "They already do." Brian stopped pacing. "This is different. You're choosing to be mocked." "No," she said. "I'm choosing not to run." Brian stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. "You think love is enough? That man can barely stand for long." Anne's chest tightened. "He stands better than many men who walk freely." Brian laughed bitterly. "You're romanticizing suffering." Anne stepped closer. "You're confusing strength with muscle." The argument ended the same way every time, without resolution, without peace. Outside their home, the resistance was louder. At the market, women whispered openly now. No effort to hide it. "She could have done better. She's desperate. She wants to be praised for pity." One afternoon, Anne overheard a woman say, "She wants to look holy." Anne closed her stall early that day, her hands shaking as she packed away fabric. She felt exhausted, not in her body, but in her spirit. Later that evening, Elijah Kwarteng noticed the change immediately. "You're quieter than usual," he said as they walked. "I'm just tired." "Tired from work?" he asked, "or tired from listening?" Anne didn't answer right away. "Then both." Elijah nodded. "Do you want me to speak to your family?" Anne stopped walking. "No." He looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because this is my choice," she said firmly. "And I don't want them thinking you had to convince me." Elijah studied her face. "You don't owe anyone proof." "I know," she replied, "but I want them to understand that this isn't weakness." Elijah's voice dropped. "And if they never do," Anne exhaled slowly, "then I will still marry you." That answer startled even her. Elijah said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "You know, choosing me means choosing a harder road." Anne met his eyes. "Every road is hard. I just choose which hardship I respect." They continued walking in silence, the weight of her words settling between them. A few days later, Mama Naliaka received a visitor. Linda Owino arrived unannounced, her perfume reaching the doorway before her voice did. "I came as a friend," Linda said, sitting confidently on the worn sofa. "People are talking." Mama Naliaka frowned. "They always talk." "Yes, but this time they're worried," Linda replied smoothly. "Anne is ruining her future." Mama Naliaka stiffened. "You don't know my daughter." Linda leaned forward. "I know opportunity when I see it, and I know foolishness." Mama Naliaka's jaw tightened. "Watch your words." Linda smiled. "You raised Anne well. That's why I'm surprised you're letting her do this. Do what? Marry a man who will depend on her forever." Mama Naliaka stood. "This conversation is over." Linda rose slowly, adjusting her dress. "When life becomes unbearable, don't say no one warned you." After she left, Mama Naliaka sat alone for a long time. That night she stood outside Anne's door, listening to her daughter's soft breathing. Fear settled deep in her chest, not of Elijah, but of the world that would never stop testing Anne's resolve. Meanwhile, Brian made his own decision. He confronted Elijah directly. "You need to call this off," Brian said bluntly when he found Elijah resting near the roadside. Elijah looked up calmly. "That's not your decision. It's my sister's life," Brian snapped. "You can't protect her." Elijah's expression didn't change. "Protection isn't always physical," Brian scoffed. "That's easy to say when you have nothing to lose." Elijah rose, carefully gripping his crutches. "I have everything to lose." Brian paused. "Then why do this?" Elijah met his gaze. "Because Anne saw me when I was invisible." Brian said nothing. As he walked away, doubt crept in, not about Elijah's intentions, but about his own assumptions. The night before, Anne was to go for her final dress fitting. Mama Naliaka finally spoke the words she had been holding back. "If you marry him," she said quietly, "life will be heavier." Anne nodded. "I know. You may suffer. I know. You may regret this choice." Anne looked at her mother, eyes steady. "I may regret many things in life, but not choosing love." Mama Naliaka's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Anne into her arms. "Then may God give you strength." Anne held her mother tightly, knowing that opposition did not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it came from love that was afraid. Outside, unseen and uninvited, destiny continued to move. And though Anne did not yet realize it, every argument, every warning, every doubt was preparing her heart. Not for failure, but for a truth so overwhelming, it would soon silence every voice that questioned her choice. Silence became the loudest presence in Anne Mwikali's life. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that lingered after questions went unanswered, after words were carefully chosen and carefully withheld. As the wedding approached, Anne began to notice how often Elijah Quarting disappeared into that silence, carrying pieces of himself she could not touch. It was never dramatic. Elijah never stormed off, never raised his voice, never lied outright. He simply withheld. Small things at first. When Anne asked about his childhood, Elijah smiled and said it was long ago. When she asked about his parents, he replied, "They're not part of my life." When she asked where he lived before coming to town, he said, "Far from here." Each answer was true, but incomplete. Anne sensed it. She felt it in the pauses between his words, in the way his eyes drifted away when the past crept too close. One afternoon, Anne finished sewing a dress earlier than expected and decided to surprise Elijah. She walked toward the small compound where he rented a single room. It was modest, quiet, tucked behind a row of aging shops. As she approached, she slowed her steps. Elijah stood near the doorway, phone pressed to his ear. His back turned. His posture was tense, unlike the calm presence she knew. "I told you not to come," he said quietly. Anne froze. There was a pause, then his voice again lower now. "It's too late for that." Another pause. His hand tightened around the phone. "No," he said firmly. "I won't explain myself." Anne's heart began to pound. Elijah turned suddenly and saw her. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, then restraint. He ended the call without another word. "Anne," he said gently, "I didn't know you were coming." I can see that she replied, forcing a smile. "I thought we could walk." "Yes, of course." They walked, but something between them had shifted. Anne waited, giving him space to speak. He didn't. Finally, she said, "Who was that?" Elijah didn't look at her. "Someone from my past." Anne nodded slowly. "Do they know about the wedding?" "Yes." And he stopped walking. Anne stopped with him. "They think it's a mistake," Elijah said carefully. Anne's chest tightened. "Because of me, because of everything," he replied. She searched his face. "Elijah, are you hiding something from me?" He met her eyes, then really met them. His gaze was steady but heavy. "I'm protecting you," he said. From what? He hesitated. "From complications." Anne shook her head gently. "You don't get to decide what I can carry." Elijah looked away. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," she said, her voice firm but pleading. He was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Some truths don't free people," he said. "They burden them." Anne felt a sharp sting behind her eyes. Not anger, but fear. "Do you trust me?" she asked. "Yes," Elijah replied instantly. "Then why won't you trust me with your truth?" Elijah didn't answer. That night, Anne lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. Trust, she realized, was not just about believing someone wouldn't hurt you. It was about believing they would let you stand beside them, even when the weight was heavy. The next morning, Mama Naliaka noticed the change. "You didn't sleep," she said. Anne shook her head. "No." Her mother hesitated. "Is he causing you pain?" Anne paused. "Not directly." Mama Naliaka frowned. "Indirect pain still hurts." Later that day, Brian returned from town with news. "People are saying strange things," he told Anne quietly. "About Elijah." Anne's stomach dropped. "What kind of things?" Brian hesitated. "That he's not who he says he is." Anne's voice sharpened. "Says who?" Brian shrugged. "People who claim to know him." Anne clenched her fists. "Did you believe them?" Brian sighed. "I don't know what to believe anymore." That afternoon, Anne went to the market alone. As she walked between stalls, she felt eyes on her. Conversation stopped when she passed. Near the entrance, she saw her, the well-dressed woman. She stood perfectly still, watching Anne with unsettling calm. This time, Anne didn't look away. She walked toward her. "Do you need something?" Anne asked. The woman studied her closely, as if measuring her worth. "You're Anne Mwikali," she said. "Yes." The woman's lips curved into a thin smile. "You're brave." Anne stiffened. "I don't know you." "No," the woman replied. "But I know the man you're marrying." Anne's heart began to race. "Then you should speak to him." The woman chuckled softly. "Oh, I will." "What do you want?" Anne asked. The woman leaned closer. "To see how much you're willing to lose." Before Anne could respond, the woman turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill that clung to Anne's skin. That evening, Elijah didn't come by. Anne waited and waited. When he finally arrived, the sun had already set. "You saw her," he said quietly. Anne's breath caught. "So you do know her?" Elijah nodded. "Yes. Who is she?" Anne demanded. He exhaled deeply. "Her name is Madame Ya Kwarting." Anne stared at him. "Your mother?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "No." "Then who? She's someone who owns my past," he said. Anne stepped back slightly. That's not an answer. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Anne, please. Trust me a little longer. Her voice trembled. I am trusting you, but I'm also standing in front of a future I don't understand. Elijah reached for her hand, then stopped himself. I never wanted this to touch you, he said. That's why I stayed quiet. Anne swallowed hard. Silence doesn't protect me. It just leaves me alone. Those words cut deeper than she expected. Elijah nodded slowly. You're right. He straightened. If you still choose me after the wedding, he said, you'll know everything. Anne felt a rush of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, loyalty, love. And if I don't? She asked. Elijah met her eyes. Then I'll accept that too. Anne turned away, tears blurring her vision. As she walked home alone, one truth became painfully clear. Love had brought her this far, but honesty, full unguarded honesty, was the bridge she still had to cross. And time was running out. Humiliation rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly dressed as laughter, wrapped in false concern and delivered in front of witnesses who pretended not to enjoy it. For Anne Mwikali, it arrived on a busy market morning. The sun was already high when Anne set up her stall, laying out bolts of fabric with practiced care. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was restless. The conversation with Elijah the night before still echoed in her chest, his hesitation, his promise to explain everything after the wedding, after she thought bitterly. Why is truth always postponed? She was adjusting a piece of bright blue cloth when a familiar voice cut through the air. Well, if it isn't the bride. Anne didn't need to look up to know who it was. Linda Owino stood a few steps away, surrounded by two women who laughed too easily. Linda's clothes were immaculate. Her posture relaxed, her smile sharp. Anne kept her eyes on her work. Good morning. Linda clicked her tongue. Still working so hard I thought brides were supposed to rest. Anne straightened. Some of us can't afford rest. One of the women snickered. Linda stepped closer, pretending to examine the fabric. Tell me, Anne, who will carry you when you're tired after the wedding? Anne's hands stilled. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Linda tilted her head. Oh, forgive me. I forgot. Your husband can barely carry himself. Laughter rippled around them. Anne felt heat rush to her face, but she forced herself to breathe. He doesn't need to carry me, she said. I can walk on my own. Linda smiled wider. Of course you can. You'll have to. A small crowd had begun to gather. Curious eyes, hungry ears. Another woman chimed in. People say you married him for sympathy. Anne finally looked up, her gaze steady. People say many things. Linda leaned in closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate. You know what they also say. That when life gets hard, you'll regret this. That you'll come begging back to the world you rejected. Anne's heart pounded, but she refused to step back. I didn't reject the world, she said. I rejected its cruelty. Linda laughed softly. You think you're brave now, but bravery fades when reality arrives. The crowd murmured in agreement. Then someone spoke from behind them. That's enough. Anne turned. Elijah Kwarteng stood at the edge of the crowd, his crutches planted firmly on the ground. His expression was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Linda's smile faltered briefly before returning. Oh, the groom himself. Elijah stepped forward slowly. Each movement was deliberate. You don't have to defend her, Linda continued. We're just concerned. Elijah met her gaze. Concern doesn't sound like mockery. Linda shrugged. Truth often sounds harsh. Elijah nodded. Then allow me to share one. The crowd leaned in. Anyone who believes love is weakness, Elijah said evenly, has never survived without power. A hush fell. Linda scoffed, spoken like someone who doesn't know power. Elijah's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Anne watched him closely. She could sense the restraint in his body, the effort it took not to speak more. "Come," Elijah said softly to Anne. "Let's go." As they walked away, the whispers followed them like shadows. Anne didn't speak until they reached a quiet stretch of road. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," Elijah replied. "I did." She stopped walking. "Why didn't you say more? You could have—" "No," he interrupted gently. "That's not how I fight." Anne stared at him. "Then how do you?" Elijah hesitated. "By choosing when silence is strength, and when it's fear." Anne's chest tightened. "And today," he said honestly, "it was both." That admission surprised her. They continued walking in silence. That night Anne couldn't stop replaying the scene. The laughter, the stares, the way Elijah had stood there present but restrained. Part of her admired his control. Another part of her ached. The next morning, Brian confronted her. "I heard what happened at the market," he said. Anne sighed. "Of course you did. They humiliated you," Brian snapped, "and you let them." Anne looked at him sharply. "I didn't let them. I survived them." Brian shook his head. "You shouldn't have to." "And yet I do," she replied. "Every day, with or without Elijah." Brian fell silent. Later that afternoon, Mama Naliaka sat beside Anne holding her hand. "I saw how they looked at you today," her mother said softly. "I wanted to speak. Why didn't you?" Anne asked. Mama Naliaka smiled sadly. "Because you didn't need saving, you needed support." Anne leaned into her mother's shoulder, exhaustion finally seeping through. Meanwhile, across town, Elijah sat alone in his rented room, his phone resting on the table in front of him. It buzzed. "Yeah." He stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "You embarrassed yourself today," Madame Yakwarting's voice said, coolly. Elijah closed his eyes. "I didn't come to be judged. You came to be stopped," she replied. "This wedding ends soon." Elijah's grip tightened. "You don't control my life." A short laugh. "I built it." Elijah hung up without responding. He leaned back against the wall, the weight of years pressing down on him. He had hoped foolishly that Anne might be spared the ugliness of his past. But the world was already pulling her into it. That evening, Anne met Elijah outside her home. "You okay?" she asked. Elijah nodded. "Are you?" Anne hesitated. "I'm tired of being strong." Elijah's voice softened. "You don't have to be strong with me." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "Then don't keep me in the dark." Elijah swallowed. "I won't. Not much longer." Anne nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at her. As they parted ways, Anne realized something painful. Public humiliation had tested her pride. Family opposition had tested her resolve. But this silence between her and Elijah was testing her trust, and with each passing day that test grew heavier. The wedding was only days away, and the eyes of the entire town were waiting for Anne to break or for something far more unexpected to unfold. Preparation for the wedding felt less like celebration and more like walking toward a public trial. In Anne Mwikali's home, there were no extravagant decorations, no overflowing gifts, no excitement buzzing in the air. Instead, there was quiet determination woven into every small action Anne took, as she folded clothes, stitched loose hems, and counted the few coins she had set aside for the ceremony. People said the wedding would be simple. What they meant was poor. Mama Naliaka moved around the house with careful purpose, sweeping the floor again and again as if cleanliness could protect her daughter from shame. Brian helped when asked, though his silence spoke louder than words. One evening, as Anne adjusted the final stitches on her wedding dress, Mama Naliaka sat beside her. "It's not too late," her mother said softly. Anne didn't look up. "Too late for what?" "To change your mind." Anne's fingers paused, then resumed. "If I change my mind now, it won't be because I was wrong. It will be because I was afraid." Mama Naliaka watched her daughter's calm hands. "And are you afraid?" Anne answered honestly. "Yes." Her mother nodded. "Then why continue?" Anne finally lifted her gaze. "Because fear isn't my guide. Values are." Mama Naliaka swallowed hard. "You sound older than your years." Anne smiled faintly. "Life aged me." Outside the house, word spread quickly. "Have you heard the wedding will be small? They couldn't even rent a proper hall. Why bother inviting people?" Linda Owino made sure the gossip traveled efficiently. At every opportunity, she reminded others loudly that Anne's wedding would be a lesson about pride, she said one afternoon, sipping tea among friends. And what happens when you ignore reality? Meanwhile, Elijah Kwarteng prepared in silence. He sold the few things he owned that held sentimental value. A watch, a jacket, an old radio. Each item carried memory, but none more important than what lay ahead. At night he sat alone in his room, staring at the wedding invitation Anne had carefully handwritten for him. "I choose you," it said simply. Elijah folded it slowly, his jaw tight. He had never intended for things to go this far. He had planned to leave town quietly, to disappear, to protect Anne from the storm he knew would come once his past surfaced. But love had a way of altering plans. The day before the wedding, Anne went to the market for the last time as an unmarried woman. She noticed the stares immediately. Some people watched with curiosity, others with amusement, a few with genuine concern. A woman she barely knew approached her stall. "You're brave," the woman said, quietly. Anne looked up, surprised. "Thank you. But bravery doesn't feed children," the woman added before walking away. Anne exhaled slowly. She had heard every version of that sentence before. Later that afternoon, Elijah arrived to walk her home. He moved more slowly than usual. "Are you tired?" Anne asked. "No," he said. "Just thinking." She studied him. "About tomorrow." He nodded. "About everything after it." Anne stopped walking. "Say it." Elijah met her eyes. "Once we're married, there's no going back, I know," she replied. "And if the world becomes harsher." Anne smiled sadly. "It already is." Elijah reached into his pocket, then hesitated. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Anne's heart jumped. "Now." "Yes." He opened his mouth, then a voice interrupted them. "Elijah." They turned. Madame Ya Kwarteng stood a short distance away, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her clothes were elegant, her posture unyielding. Anne felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Elijah," Madame Ya said again. "We need to speak." Elijah's shoulders stiffened. "Not now." Madame Ya glanced at Anne. "She deserves to hear this." Anne's pulse raced. Hear what Madame Ya's eyes flicked back to Elijah. "The truth." Elijah shook his head. "You promised." Madame Ya smiled thinly. "I promised nothing." Anne stepped forward. "Please," she said, voice firm. "If something concerns my future, I have the right to know." Madame Ya studied her carefully. "Do you want to know who you're marrying, or who you think you are marrying?" Elijah moved between them. "Stop." Madame Ya's voice hardened. "You cannot hide forever." She turned to Anne. "Tomorrow," she said, "your wedding will answer every question." Then she walked away. Anne stood frozen. "What was that?" she asked quietly. Elijah exhaled deeply. "A complication I hoped would stay buried." Anne's chest tightened. "Is she trying to stop the wedding?" Elijah hesitated. "She's trying to control the outcome. Control what?" Anne pressed. Elijah looked at her eyes, filled with conflict. "Please, trust me one more night." Anne searched his face, fighting the urge to demand answers. "One more night," she repeated softly. That night, Anne barely slept. She lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the town, wondering what truth could be so dangerous that it needed to wait until vows were spoken. Across town, Elijah stood at his window, staring into the darkness. His phone buzzed again. Yeah. He didn't answer. The next morning, the day of the wedding, arrived under a pale sky. Anne dressed slowly, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. Mama Naliaka helped adjust her veil, her movements gentle but emotional. "You look beautiful," her mother whispered. Anne nodded. "I hope that's enough." Outside, people gathered not out of support but curiosity. They wanted to see what would happen. They wanted to witness the moment Mwikali finally realized her mistake. Elijah, meanwhile, stood alone in a small room, staring at his reflection. Today, everything would change. The silence he had carried for years was about to break. And once it did, there would be no turning back. The night before the wedding stretched endlessly, like a breath held too long. Mwikali sat on the edge of her bed, her wedding dress folded neatly beside her. The room was quiet, but her thoughts were not. They moved in circles around Elijah's hesitation, around Madame Ya's warning, around the fragile promise he had asked her to hold until morning. "One more night," he had said. Anne pressed her palms together, trying to steady herself. She had lived with uncertainty before. Poverty taught patience. Loss taught endurance. But this was different. This was standing at the edge of a future she could not see clearly, trusting that the man she loved would not let her fall. Outside, Mama Naliaka hummed softly as she prepared for bed. The sound drifted through the thin walls, a comfort Anne had known since childhood. She rose and stepped into the doorway. "Mama," she said. Her mother looked up. "You should rest." "I know," Anne replied. "I just needed to hear your voice." Mama Naliaka smiled faintly. "You're afraid?" Anne nodded. "Yes, good," her mother said. "Fear means you understand the weight of tomorrow." Anne swallowed. "What if I'm wrong?" Mama Naliaka studied her daughter's face. "Then you will learn. But if you're right, and you walk away because of fear, you will carry that regret, longer than any hardship." Anne felt tears gather. "Do you trust him?" Her mother paused. "I trust you." Those words settled into Anne's chest like a stone-heavy grounding. Later that night, Anne stepped outside to breathe. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the quiet street. She didn't expect to see Elijah. He stood near the gate, his silhouette familiar, his posture tense. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. "Neither could I." They stood facing each other, the distance between them filled with everything unsaid. Elijah, Anne began, then stopped. "If tomorrow brings something I'm not ready for." He nodded slowly. "I know, and if I walk away, I'll understand." He said, though the words seemed to cost him something. Anne searched his face. "Why won't you tell me?" Now Elijah looked toward the road, then back at her. "Because once the truth is spoken, it changes how people listen. I want you to hear it, when the world is watching, not when it can be twisted in the dark." Anne frowned. "That sounds like fear." He shook his head. "It's strategy." "Strategy for what?" "For dignity," he replied. "Yours." Anne exhaled slowly. She didn't know whether to feel protected or pushed aside. "Promise me something," she said. Elijah met her gaze. "Promise me that whatever happens tomorrow," Anne continued, "you will stand beside me, not behind me, not in front of me. Beside me." Elijah's eyes softened. "I promise." They stood in silence, the weight of the vow settling between them. Across town, Madame Ya Kwarteng sat in a quiet room, her phone resting on the table. She had not slept either. The years she had spent controlling outcomes, shaping narratives, preparing contingencies, all of it had led to this moment. She thought of Elijah as a boy, brilliant, stubborn, determined, and of the choices she had made to protect him, even when protection had turned into possession. "He thinks love will save him," she murmured to the empty room. She rose and picked up her phone, typing a single message. Be ready. Morning came too quickly. The town stirred early, buzzing with anticipation that had nothing to do with joy. People dressed not to celebrate, but to observe, to witness, to judge. Anne dressed slowly, her hands steady despite the knot in her stomach. Mama Naliaka adjusted her veil, blinking back tears. "You are my daughter," she said, "no matter what happens today." Anne nodded. "I know." Brian hovered near the door, uneasy. He cleared his throat. "If you need me." Anne smiled at him. "I know." Outside, the small church filled faster than expected. Faces, Anne recognized, and many she didn't pack the benches. Some whispered, others stared openly. "This is going to be interesting," someone murmured. Anne walked down the aisle with her head held high. She focused on the front of the church, on the place where Elijah was supposed to stand. It was empty. A murmur rippled through the room. Minutes passed. The pastor glanced at his watch, then toward the door. "We'll give it a moment," he said gently. Anne's heart pounded, but she didn't move. "He promised," she told herself. "He promised to stand beside me." The whispers grew louder. Did he run? Of course he did. Who wouldn't? Anne's fingers tightened around her bouquet. She refused to look back, refused to search the faces for pity. Another minute passed, then another. Pastor Samuel Adebayo stepped forward. "We'll wait a little longer." Anne's breath came shallow. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on her. And then the doors opened. Elijah Kwarteng entered the church, but not as anyone expected. He walked without his crutches. The room froze. Every whisper died mid-breath. Anne turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. Elijah walked steadily down the aisle, his posture upright, his steps firm. His face was calm, resolute. Gasps filled the room. Anne stared, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. "He can walk." Elijah reached her side and stopped. "I'm here," he said quietly. Anne's voice trembled. "Elijah, what is happening?" Before he could answer, another figure rose from the front row. Madame Ya Kwarteng. She turned to face the congregation, her presence commanding instant silence. "Today," she said evenly, "truth meets consequence." Anne felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Elijah took Anne's hand, not to guide her, but to anchor himself. Pastor Samuel looked between them, uncertain. "Is there something we should address?" Madame Ya nodded. "Yes." She turned to Anne. "You deserve to know who you are marrying." Anne's chest tightened. "I'm listening." Madame Ya's gaze swept across the room. "Elijah Kwarteng is not a disabled man who lives in poverty." A collective gasp filled the church. "He is my son." Madame Ya continued, "and the rightful heir to everything I own." The room erupted. Voices clashed. Chairs shifted. Shock spread like fire. Anne's world narrowed to a single point. Elijah squeezed her hand. "This is what I wanted to tell you," he said softly, when you could hear it clearly. Anne stared at him, tears blurring her vision. Not of joy, not of relief, but of overwhelming disbelief. The truth had arrived, and it had arrived in front of everyone. For a moment, the church existed without sound. Not silence the kind that soothes, but the kind that presses against the ears, heavy and disorienting. Anne Mwikali felt it settle into her bones as she stood at the altar, Elijah Kwarteng's hand still holding hers. His grip, firm, grounding, unfamiliar, in a way she could not yet name. "He is my son," Madame Ya Kwarteng had said, "and the rightful heir to everything I own." The words replayed again and again in Anne's mind, each repetition colliding with everything she thought she knew. Her first instinct was not anger, it was confusion. She looked at Elijah, really looked at him. His face was composed, but his eyes were alive with something raw. Not triumph, not pride, fear, not of the crowd, Of her. Whispers burst out all around them. "That's impossible! He was walking! Did you see that?" So he lied. All this time, Pastor Samuel Adebayo raised his hands, trying to restore order. "Please," he said firmly, "this is a place of worship." Madame Ya did not sit. She stood tall, unbothered by the murmurs, as if she had been waiting years for this moment. "You all judged him by what you saw." She continued, by how he moved, by what he appeared to lack. Anne's chest tightened. Elijah leaned closer. "Anne," he whispered, "please don't answer yet. Let me explain." She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't speak either. The crowd's attention shifted slowly from Madame Ya to Anne. Their eyes changed. Where there had been mockery, there was now curiosity. Calculation. Linda Owino, seated near the aisle, leaned forward sharply, her lips slightly parted. The confidence she had carried for weeks cracked visibly. "Is this a joke?" someone demanded. Madame Ya's gaze swept across the room. "No, it is a reckoning." Brian Mwikali stood abruptly. "You expect us to believe this?" he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You humiliated my sister for months." Madame Ya met his gaze calmly. "I did not humiliate her." "You did!" Brian froze. Mama Naliaka sat rigid in her seat, her hands clenched together. Tears streamed silently down her face, not of relief, not of pride, but of shock so deep it felt like grief. Anne finally spoke. Why, her voice was soft, but it cut through the room. "Why let everyone think? Why let me think?" Elijah turned fully toward her. "Because I needed to know," he said quietly, "who would stay when there was nothing to gain." Anne's breath caught. "So I was a test." "No," Elijah said immediately. "You were the answer." Her throat tightened painfully. Madame Ya stepped forward. "Elijah was injured years ago," she said. "A serious accident. His recovery was long, painful, public." Anne looked at Elijah again. His face flickered with memory. "When he healed," Madame Ya continued, "he refused to return to my world. He said wealth had made him invisible to truth." A bitter smile crossed her face. "So he hid, and I allowed it until now." Anne shook her head slowly. "You let people insult him. You let them insult me." Madame Ya's voice hardened. "I let him choose." Anne's chest burned. "At my expense." Elijah squeezed her hand gently. "At mine," he said. "I never meant for you to suffer." Anne finally pulled her hand free. The movement was small, but it landed like a blow. The room held its breath. "I stood here," Anne said, her voice trembling, "now ready to marry a man I believed needed me. I defended you. I lost friends for you. I became a joke for you." Elijah's eyes glistened. "I never asked you to, but you let me," she replied. "You let me stand alone." Her words echoed painfully against the church walls. Pastor Samuel cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should pause the ceremony." "No," Anne said sharply. "I need answers, not later, not privately, now." The crowd leaned forward. Elijah nodded slowly. "Then I will tell everything." He turned to face the room, his voice steady but heavy. "I pretended to be disabled because I wanted to be loved without leverage," he said. "I wanted a life where kindness wasn't purchased and loyalty wasn't negotiated." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the audience. "I lived with pain long enough to know what it costs," Elijah continued. "I didn't want a marriage built on what I own." Anne crossed her arms tightly. "So you chose deception?" Elijah met her gaze. "I chose vulnerability." "Vulnerability," Brian snapped. "You deceived her." Elijah nodded. "Yes, and I accept the cost of that." Anne felt her knees weaken slightly. She hadn't expected this calm acceptance, this refusal to defend himself with excuses. Linda Owino rose abruptly. "So all this time," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief, "you watched us mock him while knowing the truth." Madame Ya looked at her coolly. Yes. Linda's face flushed. And you said nothing. I listened, Madame Ya replied. Just as you did. Linda sank back into her seat, suddenly very small. Anne turned away, her chest heaving. The church that once felt suffocating now felt distant, unreal. Elijah, she said quietly, without looking at him. Did you ever plan to tell me yes? He replied. But only when I knew you had the choice to walk away without pressure. She laughed bitterly. And you thought today was that moment, I thought, he said softly, that standing beside me when the truth was exposed would give you power. Anne closed her eyes. She had never wanted power. She wanted honesty. The room waited. Pastor Samuel watched her carefully. Anne Mwikali, he said gently, what would you like to do? Anne opened her eyes. Every gaze was fixed on her now, not with mockery, not with pity, but with something new. Expectation. She felt it pressing down on her shoulders, heavy as judgment. Slowly, she turned to Elijah. You didn't just hide wealth, she said. You hid choice. Elijah nodded. Yes, and yet she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. You showed me who you are when no one was watching. He didn't speak. Anne looked at Madame Ya. You came here to control the story. Madame Ya did not deny it. And you, Anne, turned back to Elijah, chose the moment when I could least escape. Elijah's jaw tightened. I'm sorry. The word landed gently, but it did not erase the wound. Anne faced the congregation. I am not ashamed of loving a man I thought was disabled, she said firmly, and I will not be praised for marrying a wealthy one. A hush fell. She turned back to Elijah. But before I choose anything, Anne said, I need time. Elijah nodded immediately. Take all the time you need. Anne took a step back from the altar. Gasps rippled through the room. She lifted her chin. This wedding will not continue today. The decision hit the crowd like a wave. Anne walked down the aisle alone, not in shame, but in truth. Behind her, Elijah remained at the altar, unmoving. The wedding had begun as a test of love. Now it had become a test of integrity, and the answer was no longer simple. Anne Mwikali did not run from the church. She walked. Each step down the aisle felt deliberate, grounded, as if her body understood something her heart was still catching up to. The murmurs behind her grew louder, but she did not turn around. She refused to let their voices decide the shape of her exit. Outside, sunlight hit her face, too bright, too normal. The world had not paused for her revelation. People spilled out of the church in fragments, some whispering, some arguing, some silent with shock. A few looked at Anne with newfound respect. Most didn't know how to look at her at all. Mama Naliaka rushed forward, first her hands trembling as she cupped Anne's face. My child, she whispered. Are you all right? Anne nodded, though her chest still felt tight. I don't know yet. Brian arrived moments later, his expression torn between anger and concern. He lied to you, he said sharply. You did the right thing. Anne looked at him. Did I? Brian faltered. You walked away. I asked for time. Anne corrected. That's not the same thing. Inside the church, Elijah Kwarteng remained at the altar, long after Anne had left. He stood there alone, facing the empty aisle, absorbing the weight of every choice he had made. Pastor Samuel approached quietly. You could go after her, the pastor said. Elijah shook his head. Not like this. Pastor Samuel studied him. You knew this might happen. Yes, Elijah replied, and I accept it. Madame Ya Kwarteng stood nearby, her expression unreadable. This was necessary, she said calmly. Now the truth is known. Elijah turned toward her, his voice low. At what cost? Madame Ya met his gaze. Truth always costs. No, Elijah said. Control does. She stiffened. You wanted freedom. This is it. Elijah looked past her toward the open doors. Freedom that humiliates the woman I love isn't freedom. Madame Ya said nothing. Outside, Anne sat on a low wall near the churchyard, her wedding shoes in her hands. She pressed her bare feet into the cool dirt, grounding herself. The dress felt heavier now, not because of its fabric, but because of everything it represented. Linda Owino lingered at a distance, watching. She approached cautiously. "I didn't expect this," Linda said. Anne laughed softly. "Neither did I." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "I owe you an apology." Anne looked at her. "For what?" "For thinking your choice made you small," Linda admitted. "I was wrong." Anne studied her face. The arrogance she had known was gone, replaced by something fragile. "Apologies don't change the past," Anne said. "But they can change the future." Linda nodded. "I hope so." As Linda walked away, Anne felt an unexpected release. The humiliation she had endured had lost its power, not because the truth had reversed it, but because she had survived it. That evening, Anne returned home. She changed out of her wedding dress, slowly folding it with care. Mama Naliaka watched silently. "Do you regret it?" her mother asked. Anne paused. "I regret not being told the truth sooner." And Elijah Anne sat on the bed. "I don't know yet." Brian crossed his arms. "You shouldn't go back." Anne met his eyes. "I won't go forward blindly either." That night, Anne dreamed of walking down a long road that split in two. On one side comfort, on the other clarity. She stood at the center, unable to move, until she realized the road itself wasn't asking her to choose quickly, only honestly. Across town, Elijah sat alone in the dark. He had removed his jacket, his shoes, his composure. His phone lay untouched on the table. Messages from Madame Ya remained unanswered. For the first time in years, he felt fully exposed. Not because his wealth was known, but because his silence had been heard. He replayed Anne's words again and again. "You hid choice." He had believed he was protecting her. Instead, he had taken something from her, the right to decide, with full knowledge. Elijah stood and walked to the window, watching the quiet street below. He had spent so long hiding from a world that loved him for the wrong reasons that he had failed to trust the one person who loved him for the right ones. The following morning, the town buzzed. News traveled fast, twisting as it went. Some said Anne had rejected wealth out of pride. Others said she was overwhelmed by sudden status. A few said she was foolish for hesitating. Anne ignored it all. She went back to the market. At first people stared, then someone greeted her, then another. Business was slow but steady. Anne worked with her hands, letting routine restore her breath. Midday, Elijah appeared at the edge of the market. He did not approach her stall immediately. He waited. Anne noticed him. Her heart tightened, but she didn't move. After several minutes, Elijah stepped closer. "Anne," he said quietly. She looked up. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he replied, "but I needed to say something." Anne crossed her arms. "Say it." "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," Elijah said, "or to come back." She watched him carefully. "I'm here to tell you that, whatever you decide," he continued, "I won't hide anymore. From you, or from myself." Anne swallowed. "That doesn't erase what happened." "No," he agreed, "but it's a beginning." She studied his face, the same face she had loved in silence, now standing fully in the light. "You took my dignity into a room full of people," Anne said. "And you asked me to find my power there." Elijah nodded, "And I was wrong to choose that moment." Silence stretched between them. "I don't hate you," Anne said finally, "but I'm not ready to stand beside you again." Elijah bowed his head slightly. "I understand." He turned to leave. Elijah Anne called. He stopped. "Don't disappear," she said. "Not this time." Elijah met her eyes. "I won't." As he walked away, Anne felt something settle inside her. Not peace, not certainty, but space. Space to choose. The wedding had been postponed. The truth had been exposed. And for the first time since the whispers began, Anne Mwikali was no longer reacting. She was deciding. The days that followed the halted wedding did not bring relief. They brought clarity, and with it, discomfort. Anne Mwikali woke each morning to the same sounds she had always known: roosters crowing, footsteps outside, the distant hum of life continuing. Yet everything felt altered, as if the truth had rearranged the town's heartbeat. People no longer whispered when they saw her. They watched. At the market, conversations paused when Anne passed. Not with mockery this time, but with curiosity sharpened by calculation. Some women smiled too warmly. Some men greeted her with a respect that felt sudden and rehearsed. Anne did not respond differently. She worked. She measured fabric. She stitched hems. She negotiated prices. Routine became her anchor. It reminded her that she was still herself before wealth, before revelation, before the world decided how to treat her. Late one afternoon, Brian approached her stall. "You've been quiet," he said. Anne didn't look up. "I've been busy with thinking," Brian added. She smiled faintly. "That too." Brian hesitated. "People are saying you should go back to him." Anne's hands stilled. "People say many things. They say you're throwing away security," Brian continued, "that this is your chance to escape." Anne looked up at him then. "Escape what?" Brian frowned. "This life." Anne gestured around her. "This is my life. I didn't survive it just to be rescued from it." Brian sighed. "I don't want you to suffer." Anne softened. "I don't want to be bought." Brian said nothing. Across town, Elijah Kwarteng faced his own reckoning. Without the crutches, without the disguise, he was suddenly visible in a way he had not been for years. People recognized him now not as the quiet man who moved slowly, but as something else entirely. Some greeted him with enthusiasm, others with resentment, a few with fear. Elijah felt none of it mattered. What mattered was the empty space where Anne's presence used to be. He returned to his mother's estate for the first time since the wedding. Madame Kwarteng received him in a wide room filled with polished furniture and silence. "You embarrassed me," she said without preamble. Elijah met her gaze. "You exposed me," she scoffed. "You exposed yourself," he nodded. "Yes, and I'm living with it." Madame Ya studied him. "You could still fix this." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Fix what?" The narrative, she replied. Publicly. Anne would benefit. Elijah's voice hardened. "Anne is not a narrative." Madame Ya leaned back. "You think refusing wealth makes her noble." "No," Elijah said. "I think choosing with full knowledge makes her free." Madame Ya's lips tightened. "Freedom is expensive. So is control," Elijah replied quietly. That night Elijah wrote a letter. He didn't know if Anne would read it. He didn't know if she would accept it. But he knew silence would only repeat the same harm. He wrote slowly, carefully. "I hid, because I was afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons. In doing so, I took your right to choose fully. I'm sorry, not because I was exposed, but because you were." He sealed the envelope and delivered it the next morning to Mama Naliaka. Anne read it later that day. She sat on her bed, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The words did not ask for forgiveness. They did not promise anything. They acknowledged. Anne exhaled slowly, feeling something loosen in her chest. That evening she walked alone through the quiet streets. She needed distance from opinions, from expectations, from the sudden gravity of Elijah's world. She stopped near the church. The doors were closed, now the steps empty. Anne sat and let the memory pass through her without bitterness, without denial. Footsteps approached. She looked up. Elijah stopped several paces away, respecting the space between them. I didn't expect to see you, Anne said. I wasn't looking for you, Elijah replied. I was looking for myself. Anne studied him. Without the crutches, without the pretense, he seemed taller, yet also more exposed. I read your letter, she said. Elijah nodded. Thank you. They sat in silence. I didn't fall in love with your weakness, Anne said finally. I fell in love with your humility. Elijah's throat tightened, and I hid behind it. Yes, Anne agreed. You did. Elijah met her gaze. I won't hide again. Anne considered him. That doesn't mean I'll return. I know, he said. This isn't a transaction. She looked away, then back. If we move forward, it won't be because of who you are now, but because of who you were when no one mattered. Elijah nodded slowly. That man still exists. I need proof, Anne said. Not with words, with time. Elijah stood. Then I'll wait. Anne watched him go, feeling neither relief nor sorrow, only the steady presence of choice. The next day, Madame Ya made her move. She arrived at the market, with quiet confidence standing before Anne's stall as if she belonged there. You should accept help, Madame Ya said calmly. Your future would change overnight. Anne looked at her evenly. My future already changed. Madame Ya frowned. You're refusing opportunity. Anne smiled slightly. I'm refusing pressure. Madame Ya leaned closer. Elijah's world is not gentle. Anne met her gaze. Neither is mine. Madame Ya straightened, studying Anne anew. Not as an obstacle, but as a force. You're stronger than I expected, she said. Anne nodded. So is my choice. Madame Ya left without another word. As weeks passed, something shifted in the town. The gossip dulled, the spectacle faded. What remained was something quieter, respect born not from wealth, but from consistency. Elijah kept his distance. He did not intrude. He did not persuade. He lived openly, allowing the truth to stand without performance. Anne noticed. She noticed how he treated people who now flattered him, how he listened more than he spoke, how he refused to rewrite the past to appear innocent. One evening, as Anne closed her stall, she found Elijah waiting again at a distance. I'm not here to ask anything, he said. She nodded. I know. I just wanted you to see this, he added, handing her a small envelope. Inside was a deed to a community workshop. For women, Elijah said. Not in your name, not in mine, for whoever needs it. Anne looked at him, eyes searching. This isn't an apology, he said. It's alignment. Anne felt something settle, slowly, carefully into place. For the first time since the wedding, she smiled without reservation. The truth had not destroyed them, but it had stripped them bare. And from that place, something honest, fragile, deliberate, real was beginning to grow. Respect did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly after the crowd lost interest in drama and began paying attention to patterns. In the weeks following the halted wedding, Mwikali noticed how people approached her differently. Not with mockery, not with pity, with caution. Those who had laughed before now spoke softly. Those who had offered advice now asked questions. And those who had never acknowledged her existence now greeted her by name. Anne did not mistake this shift for kindness. She understood it for what it was, recalculation. At the market, Linda Owino appeared again, this time without her usual entourage. She stood a few steps from Anne's stall, hands clasped, waiting. Anne finished measuring a length of fabric before looking up. Can I help you? Linda hesitated. I came to say something. Anne nodded. Say it. Linda inhaled. I was wrong. Anne's expression remained neutral. I thought your choices made you small, Linda continued. But I was measuring you by my fears, not your values. Anne folded the fabric neatly. What do you want now? Linda swallowed. Nothing. Just to be honest. Anne studied her face. The pride softened, the certainty fractured. Honesty is a good place to start, Anne said. but it doesn't rewrite what happened. Linda nodded. I know. As she walked away, Anne felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just distance. Across town, Elijah Kwarteng was learning how quickly admiration could sour. People who once ignored him now sought his attention. Invitations arrived daily, dinners, meetings, offers disguised as friendships. Elijah declined most of them. When he did attend, he listened more than he spoke. He watched how people treated waiters, how they spoke of those not present, how quickly their smiles changed when they realized he wasn't impressed. Madame Kwarteng noticed. You're wasting influence, she said one evening. Elijah met her gaze calmly. I'm choosing integrity, she scoffed. Integrity doesn't build empires. No, Elijah replied, but it keeps them human. Meanwhile, Anne continued her routine. The workshop Elijah had arranged set up quietly without announcements began to take shape. Women came cautiously at first, then more confidently. They learned, they shared, they built. Anne did not lead from a pedestal. She worked beside them, her hands moving with the same precision she used at her stall. One afternoon, as she taught a young woman how to stitch a seam straight, she felt a familiar presence nearby. Elijah stood at the doorway. He didn't interrupt. When Anne finished, she approached him. You didn't have to come. I know, he said. I wanted to see it. She nodded. It's working. Yes, Elijah replied. Because you're here. Anne studied him. You're keeping your distance. I said I would, he replied. I won't force timing. Anne appreciated that more than he knew. Later that week, Pastor Samuel visited Anne at home. I wanted to check on you, he said gently. I'm well, Anne replied. He smiled. You've taught this town something important. Anne tilted her head. What's that? That dignity doesn't need defense, he said. Only consistency. Anne considered his words long after he left. The real test came unexpectedly. A local event, a charity gathering, was announced. Elijah's name appeared prominently among the sponsors. Anne's did not. On the day of the event, Anne attended quietly, sitting near the back. Conversations buzzed with admiration for Elijah's generosity, his humility, his transformation. Anne listened. Then the host took the stage. We are honored, the host said, to recognize Elijah Kwarteng, not just for his contribution, but for his resilience. Applause filled the room. Elijah rose slowly. He stepped to the microphone, waiting for the room to settle. Thank you, he said. But there's someone else who deserves recognition. The room stilled. Elijah turned slightly, scanning the crowd, until his eyes found Anne. She chose integrity when it cost her comfort, he continued. She refused to let wealth rewrite her values, and she built something meaningful without asking permission. Whispers rippled. She doesn't need applause, Elijah said, but she deserves acknowledgement. The host hesitated, then gestured toward Anne. Reluctantly, Anne stood. The applause that followed was uneven, some enthusiastic, some restrained. Anne accepted it without a smile, without a bow. She met Elijah's gaze. He nodded once. Later, outside the venue, Anne confronted him. You didn't ask me, she said. Elijah nodded. I know. That wasn't fair. He met her eyes. Neither was letting you be erased. Anne exhaled. You're still learning. So are you, he replied gently. That night, Anne sat with Mama Naliaka sipping tea. I see the way he looks at you, her mother said quietly. Anne nodded. He's changed. Mama Naliaka smiled. So have you. Anne considered that. I don't want to be rescued. You're not, her mother replied. You're choosing. The following days brought small moments that mattered more than grand gestures. Elijah declined a business deal that would have displaced market vendors. Anne defended a woman being overcharged by a supplier. Together but separately, they practiced the same values. Then one evening, Elijah asked to speak with Anne. Not at the workshop, not at the market, at the place where they had first walked together. They stood side by side, watching the sky darken. "I won't ask you to marry me again," Elijah said. Anne looked at him surprised. "I won't ask for promises," he continued. "Only permission. Permission for what to walk with you," he said. "At your pace, in full truth." Anne felt the weight of the moment. Not dramatic, not urgent, real. She turned to him. "No more tests." Elijah nodded. "Never again. No more silence." "Agreed. No more choosing moments for me." "I understand." Anne inhaled deeply. Then yes. Elijah didn't smile broadly. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, present steady. As they walked home together, Anne realized something had shifted, not back to what it was, but forward to something stronger. The town watched, but this time it didn't matter, because Anne Mwikali was no longer being measured by the choices she made. She was defining the measure itself. Choosing to walk together did not erase the past. It placed it gently behind them, visible, acknowledged, but no longer in control. Anne Mwikali felt the difference almost immediately. When she and Elijah Kwarteng began spending time together again, it wasn't announced. There was no declaration, no public reconciliation. They simply moved in the same direction, step by step, without hiding and without display. People noticed anyway. At the market, some smiled knowingly, others frowned. A few shook their heads as if disappointed that the drama had not ended with a clean break. Anne didn't respond to any of it. She was learning something new, how to choose without explaining. One afternoon, as Anne worked at the community workshop, a woman named Sifa approached her. Young, nervous, hands rough from labor. "I heard you walked away from a rich man," Sifa said quietly. Anne looked up. "I walked toward myself." Sifa nodded slowly. "I don't know how to do that." Anne gestured to the chair beside her. "Then sit. We'll learn together." That was how Anne led now, not with speeches but with presence. Elijah watched from a distance. He had offered funding for the workshop, and Anne had accepted, but only under one condition. No name, she had said, no plaque, no speeches. Elijah had agreed without hesitation. "Let the work speak," he had said. It did. The workshop grew. Skills turned into income turned into confidence, and confidence turned into something more dangerous than money choice. Meanwhile, Elijah faced resistance of his own. People from his former world did not appreciate his refusal to play by familiar rules. They expected public forgiveness, strategic appearances, symbolic gestures. He gave them none. In a meeting with potential investors, one man leaned back and said, "You could fix your image if you married her again." Publicly. Elijah's expression hardened. "She's not an image," the man scoffed. "Everything is an image." Elijah stood. "Then this meeting is over." Walking away had never felt easier. One evening, Anne and Elijah sat together outside her home, the air cool and still. Mama Naliaka watched them from inside, saying nothing. "You're quieter these days," Elijah said. Anne smiled faintly. "I'm listening more." "To what? To myself," she replied. "I didn't realize how much noise I was carrying." Elijah nodded. "I carried noise too. I called it protection." Anne met his gaze. "And now I call it fear," he said honestly. "And I don't want it guiding me anymore." Anne studied him. "You're changing." "So are you," Elijah replied. "You don't soften your words for me anymore." Anne laughed softly. "I stopped apologizing for clarity." They sat in silence for a moment. "Elijah," Anne said, her tone serious now. "There's something we need to talk about." He turned fully toward her. "I'm listening." "If we move forward," she continued, "it won't be as we were. I won't be the woman who defends you while being hidden, and you won't be the man who decides what I can handle." Elijah nodded. "Agreed. And I won't step into your world," Anne added, "unless I choose it." Elijah exhaled. I wouldn't want you there unless you did. She searched his face for hesitation, and found none. That means there will be moments when our paths look uneven, Anne said, when people assume you lead. I won't, Elijah replied. We'll walk side by side, or not at all. Anne felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. The next challenge came from an unexpected place. Madame Ya Kwarteng requested a meeting with Anne alone. Anne considered the request carefully before agreeing. They met in a small, neutral space. No luxury, no audience. Madame Ya wasted no time. You have influence over my son, she said plainly. Anne met her gaze. He gives it. I don't take it. Madame Ya nodded slightly. You challenge him. I respect him, Anne corrected. Madame Ya leaned forward. Then help him accept what he is. Anne's voice was steady. He already has. Madame Ya frowned. You know what I mean. Anne did. Wealth, power, legacy. I won't shape him into your expectations, Anne said, just as I won't let him shape me into yours. Madame Ya studied her in silence. Finally, she said, You are difficult. Anne smiled faintly. So I've been told. Madame Ya straightened. If you hurt him, Anne interrupted gently, he is responsible for his own heart, just as I am for mine. The meeting ended without agreement, but with something else. Respect. Weeks passed. The town's interest faded, replaced by newer stories. Anne welcomed the anonymity. Elijah did too. One evening, Elijah arrived at the workshop after hours. Anne was alone cleaning up. I wanted to ask you something, he said. She nodded. Ask. Do you still want a wedding? Elijah asked quietly. Anne paused, considering. I want a marriage, she said finally. Not a performance. Elijah smiled. Then we'll build it slowly. Anne met his gaze. Together. He nodded. Always. They did not rush. They learned how to argue without retreating, how to disagree without silencing, how to apologize without bargaining. One night after a long day, Anne rested her head against Elijah's shoulder. I don't need you to be extraordinary, she said softly. Just honest. Elijah closed his eyes. I can do that. As the months unfolded, Anne noticed how her fear had changed. It no longer asked, what if I lose everything? It asked, what if I stop choosing myself? And that question guided her better than certainty ever had. The woman who once stood alone at the altar had not been broken by truth. She had been clarified by it. And as Anne Mwikali continued forward steadily, deliberately, she understood something deeply. Love that survives exposure does not return to what it was. It becomes something stronger. Truth once spoken does not stop moving. It keeps working quietly, relentlessly, long after the room empties and the witnesses leave. Anne Mwikali felt that truth in the days that followed, not as a storm, but as a current pulling at habits, assumptions, and old reflexes she hadn't realized she still carried. Elijah Kwarteng, too, was learning what honesty demanded when it was no longer hidden behind intention. They met one evening near the riverbank where the town thinned into quiet. The air smelled of wet earth and dusk. Anne had asked to talk. Elijah came without questions. I need you to tell me everything, Anne said after a moment. Not the version shaped for dignity, the version shaped by reality. Elijah nodded. He had expected this. In some ways, he had been waiting for it. My accident wasn't simple, he began. It happened during a construction inspection. Corners were cut, safety protocols ignored. Anne listened, her face unreadable. I survived, Elijah continued, but others didn't. And when the investigation began, my mother intervened. Evidence was buried, responsibility was redirected. Anne's breath caught. So your recovery wasn't just physical. No, Elijah said. It was moral. He explained how he had walked again months later, slowly, painfully, privately, how wealth insulated him from consequence, and how that insulation began to feel like a prison. I realized something he said. If I returned as myself, whole, wealthy, powerful, no one would challenge me. Not even when they should. Anne's jaw tightened. So, you chose disappearance. Yes, Elijah replied. I chose to be small. Anne closed her eyes briefly. Being small is not the same as being honest, I know, Elijah said quietly. I learned that too late. She opened her eyes. You didn't just step away from power. You stepped away from accountability. Elijah nodded. And I won't do that again. Anne studied him. What does accountability look like now? Elijah exhaled. It looks like reopening what was closed. It looks like facing people I avoided. It looks like consequences. Anne felt the weight of his words. And are you ready for that? Elijah met her gaze. I am. Even if it costs me. Silence settled between them, not tense but deliberate. Anne spoke again. You know what hurt the most? Elijah waited. Not the revelation Anne said, but realizing that you believed love had to be tested. Elijah's shoulders sagged. I was afraid love would change when the truth arrived. Anne nodded. It did. His chest tightened. For worse, for real, she replied. They sat with that. A few days later, Elijah requested a public meeting. Not a press event, not a celebration, a meeting. Town leaders, workers, families affected by the old construction project, people whose names had been footnotes if mentioned at all. Anne attended not beside Elijah, but among the community. Elijah stood at the front, hands visible posture. Open. I am responsible, he said simply. Not just for what happened, but for what didn't happen after. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I cannot undo loss, Elijah continued, but I can stop hiding from it. He outlined steps: independent audits, compensation funds managed by community representatives, legal cooperation. No grand promises, no moral speeches, just action. Anne watched closely, not with pride, not with approval, but with discernment. This was the man she needed to see. After the meeting, reactions were mixed. Some were grateful, some were skeptical, some were angry. Elijah accepted all of it. That evening, Anne visited him. You didn't look back at me, once she said. I didn't want to perform, Elijah replied. I wanted to speak. Anne nodded. You did. She paused. I won't stand beside you to soften consequences. I wouldn't ask you to, Elijah said. But Anne added, I will walk with you if your steps stay honest. Elijah met her eyes. They will, Madame Yakwarteng reacted swiftly and coldly. You're dismantling decades of work, she said. Elijah's voice was calm. I'm dismantling silence. You're jeopardizing everything, she snapped. Elijah nodded. Including your control. Madame Ya's gaze hardened, and her influence. Elijah's jaw tightened. Anne doesn't influence me. She reminds me. Madame Ya said nothing more. Days turned into weeks. The town adjusted. Not quickly, not neatly, but something changed. Anne noticed it in small ways, the way women spoke up in meetings, the way men listened longer before dismissing concerns, the way the workshop became a place of decision rather than dependence. Elijah kept his word. He didn't announce generosity. He didn't negotiate forgiveness. He didn't seek validation. He showed up. One night as Anne closed the workshop late, Elijah waited outside. I'm not asking you to come home with me, he said gently. I just wanted to walk. They walked. Anne spoke first. I used to think love meant sacrifice. Elijah listened. Now she continued. I think love means alignment. Values moving in the same direction. Elijah nodded. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then, Anne said. They stopped beneath a tree where lantern light flickered. Elijah, Anne said quietly, I need to know something. He turned to her. If tomorrow everything you own disappears, status, wealth, influence, who are you? Elijah didn't hesitate. The man who stays. Anne felt something ease inside her. And you! Elijah asked. She smiled faintly. The woman who chooses. They stood there not as a couple defined by a wedding, but as two people defined by decisions. Anne realized something important then. She had not paused the wedding because she feared truth. She had paused it because she respected it. And now, watching Elijah step fully into consequence without armor, she understood that reconciliation was not about returning. It was about rebuilding slowly, visibly, without shortcuts. The man who once hid behind humility had learned to stand in responsibility. The woman who once stood alone at the altar had learned to stand within herself. And between them, something rare was taking shape. Not romance fueled by spectacle, but partnership anchored in accountability. When Anne reached for Elijah's hand that night, it was not tentative. It was deliberate. Not a promise of ease, a promise of truth. The second time, Mwikali agreed to stand beside Elijah Kwarteng. There were no witnesses waiting for a spectacle. No flowers crowded the aisle. No whispers filled the air. No one came to measure the value of her decision. It began quietly, on an ordinary morning when Anne woke with a sense of calm she had not known before. Not certainty. Calm. She dressed, prepared tea, and stepped outside to feel the early air. The town was waking slowly. Children passed with school bags. Vendors arranged goods. Life in its unremarkable persistence continued. That was when Anne understood something essential. She no longer felt watched. The world had moved on, and in that absence of attention, her choice felt lighter and truer. Later that day, Elijah came to see her. Not with plans, not with requests, with presence. They walked together toward the workshop where women were already gathered, laughing softly as they worked. Elijah paused at the entrance. "I won't come in unless you want me to," he said. Anne looked at him. "This place isn't mine alone." He nodded. "Then I'll follow your lead." She smiled faintly. "That's new." Elijah smiled back. "It's necessary." They spent the day working side by side, not as benefactor and organizer, not as future husband and wife, but as two people sharing responsibility. Elijah learned to listen without offering solutions. Anne learned to accept support without surrendering control. In the quiet rhythm of shared effort, something settled. That evening, Anne invited Elijah to sit with her and Mama Naliaka. It was the first time since the halted wedding that they had all shared a meal together. Mama Naliaka watched Elijah carefully as he ate, how he waited before speaking, how he listened more than he explained. Finally she spoke. "My daughter stood alone once," she said. "I will not let her do so again." Elijah met her gaze. "Nor will I." Mama Naliaka nodded slowly. "Then understand this. Love will not excuse you, and humility will not save you." Elijah inclined his head. "I wouldn't want them to." The words were simple, but they carried weight. After the meal, as Anne walked Elijah out, she stopped at the gate. "I don't want another wedding like the first," she said. Elijah nodded immediately. "Neither do I. I don't want a wedding to prove love." Anne continued. "I want a marriage that practices it." Elijah took a breath. "Then let's build it before we name it." Weeks passed. There was no announcement, no public reconciliation, only continuity. Elijah continued the difficult work he had begun, facing legal process, listening to grief without defense, relinquishing control without resentment. Anne watched not as a judge, but as a witness. At the same time, Anne grew into herself in new ways. The workshop expanded into a cooperative. Women made decisions together. Profits were shared transparently. Mistakes were addressed openly. Anne did not become softer. She became clearer. One afternoon, Elijah found her alone at the workshop reviewing numbers. "You're good at this," he said. Anne looked up. "I always was." Elijah smiled. "You didn't need saving." "No," she agreed. "I needed respect." Elijah hesitated. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you still want to marry me?" he asked, not urgently, not anxiously, but honestly. Anne considered the question longer than he expected. "Yes," she said finally. "But not to complete a story." He waited. To continue one, she finished. Elijah exhaled relief and gravity mingling in his chest. "Then we'll do it your way," Anne corrected gently. "Our way." They chose a date quietly. No invitations sent beyond those who mattered. No preparations made to impress. On the morning of the ceremony, Anne dressed simply. No veil, no borrowed elegance, just herself. Mama Naliaka adjusted Anne's collar, her eyes bright. "You look peaceful," she said. "I am Anne," replied. Outside, Elijah waited not at an altar, not in a church but under a large tree near the edge of town. A place where they had often walked, a place without walls. Pastor Samuel stood nearby his presence, calm and unobtrusive. A small group gathered, no crowd. As Anne approached, Elijah did not watch the people. He watched her. When she reached him, he took her hands not to claim, but to connect. Pastor Samuel spoke simply. "Marriage is not the joining of strengths," he said. "It is the agreement to carry weakness without control." Anne felt the truth of those words settle deep. Elijah spoke first. "I choose you," he said. "Not because you stayed when I was hidden, but because you demanded I stand when it mattered." Anne's throat tightened. She answered without hesitation. "I choose you," she said. "Not because you changed, but because you continue to." No vows promised ease. No words erased the past. But when Pastor Samuel stepped back and nodded, something unmistakable had been sealed. Not perfection, alignment. As they walked away together, there was no applause, just breath, just ground beneath their feet. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Anne and Elijah sat together in quiet. "Do you think people will ever stop talking?" Elijah asked. Anne smiled softly. "Eventually. And if they don't, it won't matter." Elijah nodded. "I used to think love meant being chosen despite flaws." And now Anne asked. "Now I think it means being challenged toward truth," he replied. Anne leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's the only kind I want." In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that Anne realized was the greatest gift. Life continued, work continued. Love deepened not through intensity but through repetition. Anne Mwikali, who once stood alone in a church filled with judgment, now stood fully in herself. Elijah Kwarteng, who once hid behind silence, now stood accountable without fear. Together, they did not become extraordinary. They became honest, and in that honesty they found something far rarer than surprise. They found peace. After everything Anne Mwikali and Elijah Kwarteng went through, one truth remains clear: love is not proven by sacrifice alone, but by truth, responsibility, and the courage to choose again with open eyes. Anne did not become strong because she married a powerful man. She was strong long before anyone knew who Elijah truly was. Her strength came from knowing her worth, even when the world tried to reduce her to pity, shame, or opportunity. Elijah did not become worthy because he revealed his wealth. He became worthy when he stopped hiding, when he chose accountability over comfort, honesty over control, and presence over performance. This story reminds us that real love does not rush us into decisions. It does not demand silence in the name of peace, and it does not test people in secret while asking them to be brave in public. Real love invites clarity. Real love respects choice. Real love understands that dignity matters more than status and truth matters more than timing. Anne walked away from the altar, not because she feared love, but because she respected herself. And when she returned, it was not to reclaim a dream, but to build a reality rooted in shared values. In life, many of us are taught to endure quietly, to accept half-truths, and to confuse patience with strength. But this story gently challenges that belief. It tells us that you are allowed to pause, allowed to ask questions, allowed to demand honesty without being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or proud. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this: love that survives truth becomes deeper. Love that survives accountability becomes lasting. Now we'd love to hear from you. What part of Anne and Elijah's journey touched you the most? Have you ever had to walk away from something you loved in order to protect your dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs it today. And if you believe stories like this, stories of courage, truth, and human values still matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More powerful African emotional stories are coming your way. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening with your heart.